Ooh, this one feels really special. Hi, and welcome to On the Table, a show where we are exploring the many shades of what it means to be human and fully alive, the ways that we're attempting to love each other and also love ourselves, where we are learning and equally importantly, unlearning, and the lifelong journey of figuring out who the fuck we are, like actually, and of course, all the places where we're asking if we're doing it right. And in the spirit of this show, figuring out who it is, we're doing things a little bit differently today. We are still live, but we have traded the bustling restaurant environment for the more intimate environs of our best friend's house, beautiful house. Thank you, Max and Alex. We have spent countless days and nights here talking and dancing and flirting often until the sun comes up. It's a space that is brimming with love and where a great many relationships have been nurtured. And that's the name of the game today, relationships. If you have met me for longer than like 3 minutes, you know that there is like literally nothing I love to talk about more. And that's because relationships are just so much of everything. There is no more potent drug than love, and I've tried a lot of them, both lovers and drugs. Heartbreak can be absolutely brutalizing and also an incredibly clarifying force if we'll allow it to be. When relationships are working, I think they can be our pathways to our most actualized, authentic, whole selves. And when they're not working, they are all manner of painful. Sometimes that pain is acute, and often, especially in long-term relationship, it can manifest as more of a dull ache, a sort of malaise, a discontent that you can't quite put your finger on, a lack of aliveness. I reckon many of us have been there at some point or another. Some of you might be there right now. We'll talk about that today. No matter what, our relationships are mirrors for us of who we are, where we're hiding, and the places where we're being challenged to do the work. Basically my entire life, have prioritized my relationships above everything else, and it's a real point of pride for me. My marriage and my community are reflections of that. And while I've always been emotionally in tune and sensitive, it wasn't until I hit rock bottom a few years ago that I, for the first time in my life, really turned that focus inward. And it was wildly uncomfortable at first, and then, like most difficult things, it's turned out to be one of the greatest and most profound gifts of my life. And the beautiful paradox I've found is that the more that I work on my relationship with myself, the more the relationships around me flourish. It's addictive and really self-sustaining in that way. And that's part of what's at the heart of my beautiful guest, Dené Logan's work, that we find our way to our most fulfilling relationships by becoming our most authentic and sovereign selves. She is a marriage and family therapist, a group facilitator, a yoga and mindfulness teacher, and she has the absolute fucking flex of being able to call relationship go Esther Perel her mentor. It's crazy. Like, gives me goosebumps every time. Her background is in depth psychology, which is also referred to as the psychology of the soul, which is to say where a lot of talk therapists will keep people sort of in their heads and in their intellectualization. Dené's digging into the soul stuff. She and I first met like 15 years ago, I think. Crazy. And she would refer to me and our dear mutual friend Lauren as wisdom sisters, which is reflective of her generosity and graciousness, because this woman drips wisdom, as you will see. Her first and incredible book, Sovereign Love. I feel like such a like morning talk show host right now. Oh, and I'm hitting my mic. Was published yesterday, May 28th. Huge. And I'm so honored to have her here amid the excitement. I'm your host, Serena Smith. Behind and in front of the camera today is my husband and director, Ian Smith, because we're talking about relationships and he might be in the hot seat. Please subscribe. Tell your friends about this, and put your questions for Dené in the chat. This is like free therapy, y'all. You should take advantage of it. And let us know how you feel about the new setting. Are we liking this? Or are we missing the soothing tones of the coffee grinder every 45 seconds? Let me know. Okay.
I mean, I'm liking this. This is like when you get to hang out in a house like this. This is incredible.
I know. It's like quite the book collection, you know?
It's gorgeous.
A few books on gnomes in here. They're pretty special. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers, and congratulations on putting this baby in the world.
Thank you. I feel like I have to drink to the cheers. Thank you. It's funny that you say a baby, because there's so much about writing a book that feels like you're birthing a baby, and then like putting it out into the world for the world to receive, which can be thrilling and vulnerable at the same time. So thank you. My book baby is out and
alive. Does it look how you expected it would?
Does the cover look? I'm like, yes, actually, I definitely like had that.
Just following the baby metaphor, you know.
I love it. Yes, it looks like me and it's father now. Yeah, I think it's very surreal. Like, I don't know what I thought it would look like or feel like, but it's here and I'm super grateful.
I mean, something that's so fascinating about this book, and I've been reading it, and it is so beautiful, and it's just like sort of one aha moment after the next. But it's not just a book that's representing your expertise, but you're also weaving your own life story into it, which is like, can be such an incredibly vulnerable experience to what you just said. Like, were there moments when you were writing it where you would have to sort of get up your gumption and say, okay, Dené, you need to be more honest about this. Like, let yourself be seen a little bit more.
Certainly. I think because so much of your training as a therapist as well is to not make yourself the focus. And so, there were points in the back of my mind where I would think like, oh, my clients are going to read this. Like, that's fascinating. And at the same time, I think at this point, one of my friends, John Kim, often uses the metaphor of like, I've swam too far past the breakers at this point to like go back. And I have for a while now been pretty transparent about my process. And, I think the thing about being a therapist that's always struck me is we're all sort of doing the same thing of imagining like somebody out there has it figured out, like somebody's highlight reel in perfect life is different than mine. And what I know from being a therapist is this is not true. Everybody's got stuff. Everybody's struggling with stuff. And so I'm always that person like, why don't we just talk about our stuff? Like, it would just, I think, bring so much healing for all of us. So I'm like, I'll go first. I'll talk about my stuff. So hopefully I do a little bit of that in there.
Brava. I mean, it's like the whole conceit of this show is basically that, like, we just, it's so interesting as human beings that we constantly get caught up in this idea that like other people have it figured out, that somehow there's someone out there who is impervious to suffering and is just living a life of constant ease and luxury or something, right? And then in actuality, it's like, I've worked alongside celebrity my entire life. So that's where I feel like I had my reckoning. I was like, oh, they're all fucked up also. Like, they're all a mess in some sphere or another. Like, can we all just talk about being messy,
And that's a little bit of, from my perspective, what we came here for. I mean, think about how boring our lives would be if they looked in real life what our highlight reels look like. And I think, to me, this is a life school, and we came here to gather up the little bits of curriculum that support us in becoming who we're meant to become. But I think, like, none of it's anything other than what it's meant to be. I don't think we're meant to come here and have anything figured out. What would be the point? But that's a lot of, I think, the culture that we're raised in conditions us to believe that there's a structure that life should be and should look like. And if you're not following the path that's sort of laid out for you by some external authority or doing something wrong, and I have just found that's like silly season. It's just not the case,
Well, I mean, let's talk about that, because I think that's so much of what comes up in relationships. And I think the process of even trying to figure out if you are unhappy in any capacity about, like, is it me or is it the system? Like,
it's probably the system.
It's probably the fucking patriarchy, right? But like, you see these people who are coming in and sort of laying out, I would imagine, the same kinds of issues over and over again, right?
Absolutely.
Like, what are the themes that you're seeing over and over?
What are the themes, right? I think it's something, what I've come to understand from doing this work for a while is there's so much about our societal structure that is unbelievably codependent. And even the way you were describing the way that you used to sort of process relationships, like I prioritized my relationships above everything else. It's so much of what we're conditioned, especially as women, to believe makes us a good person, right? Like I put everyone, my people ahead of me. I make myself and my needs and how I'm honestly feeling small. And a lot of times what that does is it's like a lot of suppression, of our authentic self. And I always use the, the metaphor of a beach ball underwater. It's like, if these are my emotions or my authentic self and I'm like pushing it down underneath the water, it takes a lot of effort and I can hold it down and maybe I'm using my whole body, but eventually that beach ball is gonna come to the surface out of the water like, and it's gonna be like, whoa, that was like aggressive.
Yeah.
But it's because I've been doing so much work to hold it down. But a lot of times that's what's happening in our relationships, right? Like we're just so suppressing our authentic self because we've been conditioned to. And so our authentic self will not, like the shadow elements of ourselves, will not be suppressed, but they will come to the surface in some maladaptive ways. And a lot of times that is where our relational friction comes from. So, to answer your question about like, I'm primarily a couples therapist, and what couples most frequently come to me about is just the ways that they've been conditioned not to be honest about what they really desire within this life, the way that we start to project our disappointments onto our partners, certainly a lot of like attempting to repair after infidelity, and I have, big theories on like why that occurs, but it's so much of, I believe, grappling with what society has told us our relationships, quote, should look like versus what actually brings authentic fulfillment and aliveness in our relationships over time.
Oh my God, there's so much that I want to follow up on there. I think that there's so much language right now in recent years about naming what you want, being your most authentic self. But to me, there's still sort of an issue in that counsel, in that it presupposes that people know who the fuck they are.
Yeah.
And even as somebody like me who's given myself a lot of credit for walking through the world with a lot of authenticity, I've had things coming to the fore in the last few years where I was like, whoa, that was something that I was really burying, Even deciding to make this show was just sort of like a thing that I held internally for so long and tried to convince myself, like, just be a behind the scenes person, because it's not okay to shine this brightly. It's not okay to want to shine this brightly, right? Or, feeling, Ian is the love of my life, but feeling desire for some other person, I just pathologized it and said, you're not allowed to feel that. You're a monster, in particular as a woman, right? And so it's like, yeah, we want to honor who we are authentically, but how do we get to the place of figuring that out? And can that be figured out for ourselves in relationship?
Yeah. I believe that is the question and that is the work. And I think our lives are not about like, certainly the work is to know ourselves, but I also think our work is like creating ourselves, and that's an ongoing, alive process. And there's so much about what we're conditioned to believe about who we are and what this life is meant to look like, that it's sort of like a point of arrival. Like people will come in and they'll be like, I've done the work. And I'm like, you've done the work and you're done? Like, what does that mean? You're still breathing. Like you should forever, hopefully, be doing the work. That's what it means to be alive. But to me, like there's a way that, like the Stoic philosophers used to talk about just the process of knowing ourselves, and that is actually what we came here to do. And I think that when we think about knowing ourselves, we think about that as like I need to find it so I can define it and I can be done, where it's sort of like
put it in a box.
Exactly. Versus this space of like knowing, because it's like trial and error and sampling the Raja and like being in this space of like radical self-forgiveness forever, ever. That is how I create the self that I'm becoming and evolving into,
You mentioned the infidelity piece and that you have a theory as to why that's happening. Go on.
Yeah, well, we'll just, yeah. So here's what I came to understand as I started working with couples for a while. All of us have two fundamental needs as human animals. They are the need for attachment and the need for authenticity. And depending on the relational model, it's talked about in lots of different ways. Some people will talk about it like stability versus adventure, you know, structure versus aliveness, all these different ways that we can talk about. But the way I started talking about it and sort of conceptualizing it is like the masculine framework. And in a lot of ways, we've been living in a wounded masculine paradigm from my perspective for centuries now. And then the feminine is like the aliveness, the eros, the life force, the sensuality, all of these like beautiful, alive aspects of who we all are. And these energetics aren't gendered, but they're like fundamental needs that all of us have, and they're like a struggle that's alive within all of us. Now, what's interesting about most of the relationship modalities and the research that's been done around relationships is that you'll hear all of these relationship experts and people who talk about how to have fulfilling relationships talk about like, well, the research and what it shows. And so I started to get like really curious about this research. And as I went back, what I found was that the majority of the relationship research or relational research that's been done was mostly like being drawn from research that was done or at least started in the 70s. But if you think about what life was like for women in the 70s, we weren't even allowed to have our own bank accounts until 1974, right? Like you couldn't have all of this like ability to be honest a lot of times in that research, right? And so it's done with very specific socioeconomic groups, very specific like, you know, cultural background. And that's like the research that we're drawing from, right? And so it's like, is that real, or is that sort of relationship structures that are backing up and upholding patriarchal ideas of what relationships are meant to be, which when you think about that, really we're not invested in the fulfillment of women and what actually creates a sense of aliveness and life force and eros for women. And I always want to be really clear whenever we're talking about patriarchy, so often we're not addressing what is so unbelievably harmful about patriarchal structures to and for men, right?
For everyone.
Absolutely. And so what ends up happening is there's like this unspoken war of the sexes that's happening because we're just attempting to maintain attachments at all costs, because these relationship structures have put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the masculine, the attachment, the containment, the like, this is what your relationship should look like, but not a lot of emphasis on the feminine, the aliveness, the eros, the life force. But like I was talking about with that beach ball, what we push down will come to the surface in some maladaptive ways. So if we suppress our feminine, if we suppress our life force and our eros and our need to have aliveness, it will come to the surface. And sometimes that looks like an affair. Sometimes that looks like, you know, all of these ways that I seek out, I need to still be alive outside of this relationship container, but we've sort of pathologized when those things happen. We've really sort of like the person who is like the perpetrator of the affair is the villain versus like really attempting to understand like, what was this about for you, right? And I come from a background in addiction before I started working as a therapist. And what I found was that there's so much about our relationship cycles and the ways that we sort of negotiate anxiety in relationships that's so unbelievably similar to the cycles of addiction. And so when I used to work with people in recovery from addiction, it was always more about like the inquiry around like, what did this drug do for you versus, from my perspective, again, because I sort of come from this background of the psychology that's curious from a soul perspective, right? So what did this substance, this thing that you were addicted to offer you that you were struggling to cultivate within yourself versus you are bad, this is wrong, a moral failing, which, I mean, yeah, we can slap that label on it, but it doesn't really do anything to support us understanding how we got here.
Right, and if we just continue to pathologize people for their behavior and their human longings, and then that just calcifies as shame.
Yes.
It almost reminds me a little bit of like the prison industrial complex a little bit, right? Like somebody errs, you know, we incarcerate them, we tell them that they're a particular kind of person, we ostracize them from society, and then we expect them to like come out and be fully functional human beings and like rehabilitated in some capacity. It's like, of course not, right? The cheating thing is, I think, so fascinating to me because it's like almost beyond anything else that somebody could engage in. We treat cheaters like social pariahs, even though like most people have done it at some point, you know? And I think that that's so fascinating about like this sort of cognitive dissonance and this hypocrisy that we're living in, where it's like this desire to go like, bad, I'm good. You're bad, I'm good, you know?
Yeah, well, to me, that is the conditioned rejection of our feminine. And the feminine is the aspect of ourselves that is sort of like the unknown, the untamable, the, like, you know, if you think about like masculine and feminine in terms of like the sun and the moon, the masculine is the sun, like in the daylight, what we like can see and know. The feminine is the darkness, like in the moon, the shadows, like what is like below the surface of what we're being honest about, right? And what's hard about the feminine for us as a human species is we can't tame it. We can't know for sure what this is going to look like. And there are a lot of ways when you go back and you look at the history of patriarchy, so many of the things you're talking about are by design. You can't create systems of oppression without sort of having a way that you're going to cultivate fear within the people that you are attempting to keep contained, right? So how that was done was, you know, we need women to be in a nuclear family structure in the same way that like when you had slaves, you got a slave, you got a woman, when people were sort of doling out land and property. And in order for women to fall into alignment with this and leave sort of the more matriarchal way of being and come into these structures, we had to elicit a sense of fear. And a lot of times what that looked like was women were harmed. Sometimes women were burned alive at a stake. And so that sort of thing is like multi-generational pain points that we've passed down as women, that like the worst thing possible we can do is not fall in line with this structure and being chosen and needing to be within this nuclear family system. And so when someone steps outside of that, it's sort of challenging that system that we've all been conditioned to believe this will keep you safe. As long as you get married, as long as you have a picket fence, as long as you know what your retirement's going to look like, then you'll be good. It's always been an illusion. People have always stepped outside of their marriages, but the more that it comes into our conscious awareness, it's like, you know, the matrix is being exposed, and it's really destabilizing, because it's like, if I don't know for sure that I can like be certain of this, then what am I certain of? And that feels a little bit destabilizing to the psyche.
It's always seemed a little bit confounding to me, curious to me, that we've sort of duped ourselves into believing that being in a marriage is safety. It's like people can step out, but divorces happen, people die. Like, right. The safety to me sort of feels like a fallacy, and also it's a tension that I'm deeply familiar with. I'm looking at Ian.
And like we all just like,
because, you know, for me, like I have a lot of paternal abandonment stuff. Mm-hmm. Men who played dad in and out of my life, my whole life. And so I'm very aware of where that comes up. And so I have felt that tension so intimately in my life and in our own relationship of like wanting that security and like wanting that safety and wanting to know like, oh, he's here and he's here forever and he's not leaving and he's going to protect me. And then also feeling like, actually, I don't even believe in possession or ownership. And also that's so stifling to everybody, to him, to me, you know? Do you have thoughts on this?
No. I mean, I think no. I just recognized that our marriage, when we got married, the wedding, to me, what's often the case is it's a possessive and ownership thing. The vows are in regard to that, and it just never. Our vows were not there, and it never felt for a second like that's what I was doing. Like getting this love all to myself. It was the shared experience of, you know, a wedding and shared love. That's what was there, and that's what's still there. I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, great job, babe.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Yeah, but I mean, like, how do you see that shifting, that notion of, because I think that's a really big thing to get uprooted in people's psyches and belief systems, right? This notion of possession and ownership and how much relationship is like built around that.
Yeah.
Do you see that shifting? What do you see coming to the fore in this moment?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I love that both you and Ian talk about it in terms of what I call an ownership template, and that is sort of like the historic context of what we have thought about relationships being. And what we've sort of normalized is really like enmeshed dynamics. Like if someone belongs to you, if they're your person, it's just sort of the inevitable human thing that after a while you will start to get really accustomed to them. You will barely see them. You will take this relationship for granted. And what I find with couples is that leads to a real lack of aliveness and fulfillment.
And desire, right?
And desire, right? Like if you are mine, it is really hard for me to desire you. I need you to be that erotic other, that distance between us, that like, you know, we're most attracted to our partner when they are on vacation or when we see someone else discovering them or when they're shining and it has nothing to do with me. That's when we feel that eros again, when we're sort of like, oh, how you doing, right? But to the point that you were making before, what I think is really important to highlight is there's so much about the attachment-based model of partnerships that it's like, I find my safety in knowing this person isn't going anywhere. But what that's really doing is sort of interfering with what Jung would call the individuation process. And what I realized was I was married for 12 years and there were so many ways that I was able to really hide out from my development in my marriage because it's like there was so much safety. There was so much like, if anything made me uncomfortable, it's your fault, you fix it, right? And we do a lot of this in our relationships. We're not able to be uncomfortable enough to sort of go through what are these initiatory periods, almost like these dark nights of the soul that really grow us and help us to evolve. But we've been taught societally the most important thing is that you're comfortable at all times, right? Like that's, I mean, Amazon will have it to you in 5 minutes, right? Like we just need to be comfortable. But I think it's really stunting our growth as a human race. And so to answer the question that you asked, I believe, because this is just my belief system, that all of these things are sort of unfolding synchronistically right now in this moment in history to make us uncomfortable enough to really change the way that we're doing things. And I believe that's the rise of the feminine principle, which is like, we don't get to put our security in, you know, knowing that we can control other people or that we have ownership of others. That was never what our souls came here for, but that we're moving into more of like a co-creation, a little bit like Ian was describing, in our relationships where every day this is a choice. And I don't care if you're married. And when I work with couples, I really support them in saying, how would you show up for this dynamic if you knew this isn't promised and this person might not be here tomorrow? You would probably treat it as though it was a little bit more sacred, but we can shift into that mindset when we decide to. I treat my child every day like he doesn't belong to me and I'm not promised tomorrow with him. So if that's the case, how do I want to show up as though he is like the most sacred little being in the world? And I think we absolutely have the ability to do that in our relationships as well, but it's mindfulness work and it really requires a lot of personal responsibility to do that.
Are there ways that we can remind ourselves and engage in that on a daily basis to help us move from maybe the perspective of seeking safety and comfort into an awareness and a remembering that nothing is actually promised and that lifelong safety is a fallacy and it's not that interesting anyway? Like,
yeah,
you know, I'm thinking up from like a practical perspective, like how can people sort of like remind themselves to shift their mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I love that you asked that. I think I tell people a lot of times that like I meditate on death every day. Wow. And I think some of the most transformative moments of my life have been when I've lost someone in the physical form that I just was like really rocked by the experience of losing that person, but also that it brought into my awareness, like none of this is promised. And I think that can be conceivably hard to do if I don't have, like, some things change us, like that once we see them, we can't unsee them, right? Now, that being said, a lot of what I walk people through in this book is how to take responsibility for your own energy and what that looks like to do that every single moment that you're breathing. And that I believe we are always responsible for the energy that we bring into every room, every situation that we enter. And I'm the biggest proponent of personal responsibility. And anytime you are making someone else responsible for your peace, that's on you, right? Oof. And that I don't need anyone to be anything other than exactly who they are for me to decide who I'm going to be, period. That's like a life fact, right? But so often we are outsourcing our power by telling ourselves, as soon as this person complies, as soon as this person does this, then I'll have peace. And it's like, well, if that is the case, you probably will never have peace because this other person becomes a variable that's outside of our control.
Totally.
So
all you can control is yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that begs a question when you're in relationship, and maybe most specifically when you're in long-term relationship, and we see this happen so often where there's a sort of disconnection that develops, there's a sort of deadening, like I was talking about in the intro, there's a lack of desire, intimacy is stunted, maybe it was never there to begin with.
Yeah.
How do you begin the process of figuring out, you know, to what extent am I responsible for figuring out how 100%. I'm showing up in this and like making this situation better versus, you know, what's the possibility that this relationship is just not meant to be?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I always say bring the focus back inward, and the relationship will either rise to meet you in who you're becoming, or it will change form or dissolve as it's meant to. But there's so much about what we're conditioned to believe about life that's like, I gotta make it happen, I gotta figure it out, I gotta control it. And no, you don't. Like, there's so much about our life that will just sort of unfold if we keep doing the work that is within our control, which, as we just said, is always ourselves. But you know, what I find a lot of times when we are projecting a lot of, you know, just disillusionment and a lack of, you know, fulfillment on our partner, it's because we're feeling those things about ourselves. Really, right? Like if we're really honest with ourselves, a lot of the time it's like, I don't feel good about where I am. I'm not inspired and excited about my life. And if I bring the focus back on me, a lot of times I start to feel a little bit more of that, and it shifts my perception of the entire world around me, certainly, but also my partnership. And that doesn't mean that sometimes relationships aren't meant to expire. Sometimes they are, mostly because our vision of what we want and like the direction we're headed in this life might veer off into different directions. But I really like to normalize not making that a failure and sort of saying that, like, no matter what we learn in relationships, and this relationship has been the unbelievably potent curriculum that I needed for this season of my life, because I think so often we cling and we attempt to control, and we're just so immobilized by the fear of relationships ending. And if we sort of normalize, like, relationships are meant to be what they are for as long as they are, and if they change form, that's okay. Nobody's failed here, you know?
Oh my God. You're just talking about so many things that are just like huge reckonings for our culture and our mindsets, you know, potentially things that many people maybe haven't even ever consciously thought about, right? You think about when you hear that somebody's getting divorced or splitting up, right? Like the rote response is always like, I'm so sorry, right? And of course that's appropriate because endings are hard and they're painful, of course, and they're destabilizing, and you're trying to figure out how to exist without a person that's been really entrenched in your life for so long. But whenever I hear that a relationship is ending, I'm always like, I'm sorry, and also,
How are you feeling?
Yeah, and
right?
also, like, is it also a congratulations? Because, like, sometimes and often that is the work of somebody honoring who they truly are and what they need.
That part.
And it feels like we don't give that enough credence. And I wonder, from your perspective, like, what it is societally, like, why we have this obsession with things not ending and with longevity, and like, the longer something goes on, the better it is, or the more meaningful, you know? Like, what is that?
What's that? You know, I think it's a couple things. First of all, I think that we are really conditioned to believe that successful relationships equate to longevity, and that, like, it's, again, it sort of comes back to this like patriarchal structure. As long as you're together in the bunker and everybody's safe, then you'll be okay. And it's like, well, you know, have you ever been to a wedding? I talk about this in the book, where people you know, it's like all the couples get on the floor and let's call out the number of years you've been married. And when we get to the couple who's been married the longest, everybody claps, right? It's like, oh, congratulations, that's amazing. And it's like, but we don't know anything about their marriage. Like, what if they have literally hated each other for 50 years? 100%. I sit with couples every day where I'm like, if people were congratulating these two people on staying in this, like, why are we celebrating this? They hate each other, right? But we're not conditioned to ask those questions or be curious about, like, you know, what if we asked that couple, like, would you do it all over again? Like, how fulfilling has this relationship been to you? But the larger why to the question that you're asking, from my perspective, is, especially in Western cultures, we have no capacity to discuss death. We have no ability to even be in relationship with the fact that we are going to die and that things die. We don't know how to do endings. We don't know how to have conversations around endings. And I think there's so much about just the conceptualization of death and defending against it at all costs. Even like, you know, our retirement homes, like we put people away where we don't have to see the aging process because we're taught to be terrified of it. We're taught to like attempt to hold on to youth as long as possible. All of these things, they're just such a denial of the trajectory that we are all on. But again, I think the things that we don't talk about become the shadow elements of ourselves that are sort of controlling us. And to me, the fact that we can't talk about death is just interwoven in so many of our societal struggles. You know, Alan Watts said once in a talk, I heard him say, we fear death because we're taught to, right? Like nobody talks about like, but what is it? Like, what's it like? Every single person I've ever heard speak about a near-death experience talks about it like, I didn't want to come back. It was amazing. It was like the most incredible, magical, like, I was like, oh God, do I have to go back? But we're taught, like, no, you need to like think when someone dies. That's the worst possible thing in the world.
That's the scary thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Even though we all know that inevitably that's the like one truth for sure, we know we will all be confronted with. And so I think it's like, yeah, we don't know how to grieve and we don't know how to negotiate endings and honor them. And what I really attempt to support couples in doing is saying, a lot of times letting something end and setting someone free is like that final act of love, of like really honoring this person and their soul's path in a way that we're just not honoring if we hold on at all costs because we're terrified of it ending, you know?
Oh, that really hits me in my heart. I mean, I think what's so hard in those moments, right, is trying to hold that other person's needs and their spirit, right? Because like our shit gets so in the way, right? And I mean, I feel like I'm asking you these big questions where I'm like, give me like a quick and dirty tip to like fix everything. And you're like, this is literally what I spend years working on with people. But you know, I think when we're in those moments of a potential ending or even in just a more day-to-day fashion, when you're in a moment of conflict and your shit starts to come up and those walls come up and your defenses come up and your childhood wounds come up, what can we all do in those moments to stay open and quiet the ego and make sure that we're actually still really connecting with the other person?
Yeah. You know, I think so much about what our relationship structures have taught us, and this is why I say that we're such a codependent society. And frankly, from my perspective, many of the relationship modalities up to this point have co-signed that or been in support of that. Like, we need to co-regulate our partners. And listen, it's not that that's not true and that that won't happen organically, but if you have no ability to regulate your nervous system or be in relationship with your inner landscape for yourself, that's literally you doing for your partner what you do for a child. And if that partner is not there at some point, if you cannot self-regulate, that becomes a problem. And that's when we start acting out in all of these ways that aren't in alignment with who we want to be. And our ego, sort of like the fear, starts to take over a little bit because we're just in that fight or flight response. We're just terrified you're going to leave me. And so I just need to cling and I just need to get this under control, versus like, yes, a partner can be a tool in what I believe needs to be a full toolkit of ways that I come back into myself and into my body. And that can look like, you know, I get out in nature. That can look like I take showers, I journal, I have a therapist, I have friendships. Like, there can be an entire tool kit, full of ways that I am in relationship with myself when I am flooded, other than just this one other human being who could not possibly have the capacity to be all of those things for me all the time, be that, right? And so because we have been asking that of our partnerships, it's too much, and we're just unbelievably resentful of our partners all the time. And so, to answer your question, it really becomes like I start to develop a toolkit for myself. I start to be in relationship with my inner landscape and knowing that is never someone else's responsibility. I don't care how long you've been together. It's just not the case. And it's actually how we really get into some parentified dynamics in our relationships.
God, yeah, that really resonates. Yeah, Ian's nodding.
I was going to say, it takes us back to a couple episodes to Keanu Reeves, the sex expert who came on and said something similar in terms of your relationship with sex, that you should have your own relationship with it, that you don't have to rely on your partner for everything. Sounds similar to that way of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even that to me is a way that we've been conditioned to suppress our inner feminine, because the feminine is sort of like the sensuality, and we're so conditioned to believe that, like, no, like in heteronormative dynamics, the man should be the one who sort of like leads when it comes to sex, and like he should be the one who is motivating that, or like motivating isn't the word, instigating is the word I'm looking for. But a lot of times what that leads to is like us as women just like feeling like a man should just know how to step in and like push the right buttons and make all of these like magical things happen when we don't even really know our own bodies and our own pleasure for ourselves. And so it's like, if we can't really be in right relationship with what turns us on for ourselves, it's really, again, that outsourcing of power and feeling like someone else should be able to be this omnipresent, all-knowing figure. That of course they're not, right?
Which is like wild once you articulate it. You're like, of course that's not possible, you know? Yeah, I feel like it's the, Ian, you're so right. It's like the same themes that are coming up in both of these conversations, which is that a lot of it comes down to personal responsibility and doing the work and really digging deep and getting to know yourself. And I think that is, I think on a societal level, it's not something that we place a lot of importance on, you know? Like we place so much importance on these sort of external trappings of success, and we don't give people a lot of credit for doing the work. I burnt out after a lifetime of being like deeply ambitious. I burnt out really epically a few years ago, and really, really hit a wall. And that was what provoked me finally to do the work, and in many ways was catalyzed by some things that Ian reflected to me, because he's such a good partner. And yeah, and as I was doing the work, like the things that were coming up were really difficult for a period of time, and then paved the way to be such gifts. And he started doing the work also, and we've always had a really solid union, you know. But it's been so fascinating when you're talking about developing that toolkit. Like, it's been so fascinating to see what's gone on between the two of us over the last like 3 years or so. For us, it's meditation and a gratitude practice and reading spiritual texts and a fair amount of psychedelics, and that's been sort of that's been our pathway in many ways. But it's been so fascinating to see what's happened between us, which is like we're way less reactive. We're operating from such a greater space of equanimity. We're not getting defensive. Our egos aren't coming up in the same way. When we're in a space of conflict, we can really stay in the space with the other person, in a space of empathy and sensitivity and kindness, right? And then that just paves the way for you like falling back in love with each other in a totally different way. I don't think we ever were out of love with each other. I think it's just like you sort of fall in love with each other in a more deep and intimate way or something. But no, I'm just really just giving us a lot of credit. But
it does that.
Yeah.
And that's like one of my favorite things ever. And what I think we need to normalize so much more is holding our partners with just such an unbelievable reverence, because we've normalized the opposite for so long. And that, like, you know, we sort of as women, like in the same way that we compete for like how much we hate our bodies, we compete for like whose husband is most useless. And it's just
so bizarre.
What we've normalized in a way that it's like, of course our lives don't feel fulfilling because we're just like talking about how awful they are, and like this person that I'm dissatisfied with and always complaining about, the ball and chain. And it's like, well, then why are we with them?
Yeah.
Like at some point we have to take personal responsibility for all of these are choices that we're making. Like most of us aren't in arranged marriages. And so if that's, you know, a choice I'm making and it's making me want to complain about it, like I got to take ownership of that, you know? Sorry, I interrupted you, I think.
No, I love it. You were talking earlier about the trappings of what makes a good, thriving, healthy relationship, right? And that in many ways, the things that we like think that a relationship should be about are actually not what makes something successful and happy. Yeah. What is the recipe to you? What are the components?
Makes a relationship thriving?
Well, yeah. What's present in a thriving relationship?
You know, I always say that I think a relationship needs three things to be thriving or offer fulfillment over time, and they're inspiration, respect, and a shared vision. And I think that, you know, there can be periods of time where we have one or two of those components and we're struggling with a little bit of the inspiration, right? Or like our vision's a little bit off right now and we're wanting different things, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship has expired and it needs to end. But I think that those things are like when we're like in that sweet spot of like, this feels really good. But to what you were saying before and what you were describing between you and Ian, I also think we need to normalize that if you're with the same person and you've decided, like, we've committed, we're spending our life together, you're gonna be with like 4 to 5 different people at least with that same person. We sort of think like 0 to 18, we're gonna grow and we're gonna like, you know, become a new person and change and go through adolescence and all those things. But of course that's not true. Like 18 for the rest of our lives, forever and ever, amen. We're continuously evolving and shifting and becoming a different version of self. And I think what ends up causing a lot of angst and discomfort in our relationships is like, you've changed. And it's like, of course I have. Yeah, like, that's what I came here for.
Isn't that part of the deal?
Yeah. So we can fall in love with like who you're becoming, and that is inspiring if we allow that to be something I feel inspired by versus something I feel threatened by. But again, that's me really being in that inquiry with like, what is the story I'm telling myself about what it means that Ian's different than he used to be, or he's like into some new things that like maybe aren't involving me, right? And that can feel threatening, or that can feel exciting. Like, oh, he's like becoming a new iteration of self right before my eyes. It's beautiful.
Yeah, that's definitely happening for us both.
Can I ask? Is there any way to ensure that a couple grows together, or is it like pure chance, or is it a choice?
Yeah, I think here's the thing. No, it's like the short answer to your question. There's no way to ensure it, but I believe we're moving into a time where we're just less afraid of what that means when we don't grow together. I believe we're going to join in partnership in the future when it's justified, not because we're incomplete. And to me, that's more of like a collectivist way of being as a culture. We're going to put more emphasis on community, because I think what the last 4 to 5 years have shown us, to me, is how much this nuclear family structure not only isn't actually working, but it's dying. And as we move more into like a collectivist way of being, and what I mean when I say that is like, we just support one another in community. And that again is the rise of the feminine. The feminine is collaborative. The feminine is the aspect of us that used to join together in circles and be real with one another and support one another with our intuitive gifts and all of these things that we're like coming into this remembrance of. And as we do that, I think we're going to have so many people that we form beautiful, secure attachments with, that it's going to be less of a like, oh my, if I don't have this one person forever and ever, I'm going to die. That it's like, as long as it's justified and it makes sense and we both have a shared vision of what we want to build, I believe that's what relationships are going to look like in the future, is more surrounding like our missions and like what we came into these lives to do as a soul. And that like when I meet my soul partner, we're gonna like join together and carry on in our mission for as long as it's justified. But I don't think we'll have that ego attachment to it meaning something that's like horrific or detrimental to our sense of self if and when it needs to change form or end, you know.
I mean, I love your sense of optimism. Why do you think it's changing right now?
Well, I'm like, it's not mine, like it was written. Like, you know, there actually are, if you go back and you look at like the Thoth texts and like ways that they talked about like all of the shifts that were going to happen within humanity during the Aquarian Age. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with, like, the beginning of the Aquarian Age was in 2023. So we're here. Wow. And a lot of the, you know, it's like anything that is dying or changing form, it's not like a quiet end, right? Like an elephant makes a lot of noise as it tumbles to the ground, but I think that's what we're witnessing within humanity. And I think there is going to be a renaissance of the feminine. We've had like 3,500 plus years of patriarchy. It's like enough already. Like we need to try another way, because there's so many ways, not only that we are so disconnected from our souls and from lives that have meaning, but we're literally destroying Mother Earth. Like talk about like the disconnection from the feminine. We are literally destroying the earth that we are inhabiting, because we are so disconnected from meaning and from actually being conscious and present. And that was what was written, that the human race was going to get so unbelievably disconnected from meaning and from like striving to like have lives that they were like proud of living, that there was going to be a reconfiguration of societies, and that in that time, the old way of being was going to die off. I think, you know, it's, to me, like, I'm kidding things, so much of our work right now is to hold the vision of what's possible, show up in the best way that we can, taking responsibility for our own energy, as I write about in the book, but knowing that some of this is by design, you know, and that's not to sort of be in this space of apathy or not caring about the things that are happening in the world that are unbelievably heartbreaking as we witness them. But I think we have to believe that, you know, just like that flicker of light, and that there is a way that we will move out of this if we all take responsibility for holding the vision of something better. But if we sort of say like, when these people go first, then I'll be a different person. Like, no, everybody, like for ourselves, we have to take responsibility for the ripple that we can create when we bring the energy that we want to see in the world into the world. So yes, I have a lot of faith, because I know the time that we're living through, but I also know that there's going to be some darkness before we're in that space of humanity rising. But I have a lot of faith of, you know, the world that our children are going to inherit, but it requires all of us just really taking responsibility for our potential.
I'm here for it. I'm here for it. I wanna ask you one more question before we move on to our signature segment, which is that you got divorced, or as you might say, your relationship expired a few years ago, and you re-entered the world as a single parent, and as a single parent, I was raised by a single mom. As a single parent, also as a Black woman, I can only imagine like the perception piece that you were sort of contending with, also in terms of you know, narratives and stereotypes and whatever.
Yeah, before you ask your question, I just want to interrupt you for a second, because I think it's important, and I always refer to myself as a single woman with a child and not a single mom.
Ooh, that's
because
a nice recalibration.
My child is an unbelievably present father, and not every woman has that. And so
real.
I think it's really important to honor the women that are actually doing this by themselves by saying that's not me. And I think to pretend that I don't have all of the support I do just really doesn't honor him and, you know, all that he is in my life. So sorry, but carry on.
No, that's amazing, and I appreciate that. It's true, there is such a distinction. And we do want to honor Mikey and all this.
Yes.
But then, like, you re-entered the dating pool, and I'm so curious about how, as a therapist working with couples and then going from coupledom to singlehood, how that potentially changed your own perspective on what it means to be a single person in this universe, and also how you're contending with dating in this modern world of apps.
In this modern world of apps. Well, I definitely don't go on the apps, but yeah, you know, I'm that mystical being, I guess, that just believes that I am going to have all of the collisions that I'm meant to have. And I feel like, while in some ways it's been so unbelievably beautiful and enlivening to experience men at this like phase of my life, and I think I've fallen in love with masculinity in ways that, like, you know, when I got married, I'm like, how old was I? I was a baby. It feels like another life. But I was really young and really disconnected from myself, and so, you know, experiencing masculine energy as the woman that I am today is like a whole different thing, because I think as women, what nobody tells you about your 40s is you're just so much more an embodied sense of self. You're so much more like confident and like what you like and what you desire and what you're not interested in, and it feels really beautiful and empowering. And so I love those aspects of it. And you know, I was married for 12 years, and so to me, like, the way that I feel about life today is a little bit less like, oh, I'm like hungry to like fill a void, because there's no void here. Like, I am more in the space of like, I will join in a relationship or a partnership with someone when it's justified, but right now it would have to be so much better than my solitude for me to be interested. And that doesn't mean that I don't like love connection and like haven't met incredible people, but I'm just not like interested in someone being here just to like have someone here. And I really need to feel unbelievably inspired by who someone is. And so I believe, like, you know, when and if I'm meant to like be in union with someone again, like, I'm open to it, but in the meantime, I'm just sort of sampling the Raja of life, and it feels good.
Sampling the Raja of life. I love it. You were saying earlier that like you entering partnership when it's justified, not because you feel a sense of incompleteness, which I think is so. I think singlehood is another thing that we tend to like pathologize as a society. But if you are a single person and you are longing for partnership, and it's leaving you in that space of hunger, like, is there, you know, how can people recalibrate that for themselves?
I think there's no worse time than that to join in partnership, to be completely honest. And I know it's going to be a really unpopular opinion, but what ends up happening is, if I believe that I am like looking for this person for me to exhale and to feel good, when that person is here, what ends up happening is I've put like all of this energy around like who they're going to be and what we're going to do together and how they're going to complete all of these things, and they're not doing that. And so I start to feel really let down and resentful. What I would suggest, and I do suggest to so many of my single clients, is to trust in life. And this is a little bit of us returning to that feminine wisdom, right? Like, get out there and sample the breadcrumbs of your bliss. Like, start to join communities and go on trips and live your life as if you're not waiting for your life to begin when you're partnered. It's so much of what we're taught. It holds us back from fully living. And I believe the reclamation of the feminine is like, there's nothing incomplete here. Like, this is amazing. And to me, that is like the strongest form of activism, really, as women, because I think there's so much about the way that women are conditioned, especially, like, that you're somehow defective or your market value has gone down if you reach a certain age and you haven't been like plucked up like a piece of fruit and chosen. And
you're like, says who?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you heard about like that like 4B movement in South Korea. Have you heard about this?
No.
Long story short, and I'm just like learning about this, but basically there's like the last like 5+ years, I guess there's been like a movement of women that have just decided to like either be celibate, or that they're not going to get married, or they're refusing to have babies. And it's like doing all of these things to their birth rate, and they're like, you know, their schools have like no children to like enter the schools. And it's basically like their advocacy, or their activism, excuse me, their form of activism is, we're not going to join into partnerships in a misogynistic society anymore because we don't have to. And I think there's a way, like, certainly we don't need to be celibate or like decide that we're not going to have relationships with men. I don't think that that's the answer, but I think that there's a way of saying, like, I'm not going to do that because I'm believing in the lie that I'm incomplete. I'm going to join in a relationship when it's justified, because the person that I've just collided with and who they are makes it like impossible for me not to want to be in partnership with them, you know?
It should feel impossible to do otherwise. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, one viewer question. Thoughts on... You're just reading it for yourself. Dené, let me do my job.
Clearly, I'm not meant for TV. I'm like, what?
What? Thoughts on how to pull off a long distance relationship?
I mean, long distance relationships are my dream, but I tend to run a little bit more avoidant. Yeah, I think it's a little bit like, I think it either works for you or it doesn't. I think there's so many things about a long distance relationship that can be beautiful. The people I know that are in long distance relationships, like, they're on the phone all the time, and they really have to be intentional, and they have amazing conversations. And then there is that like eros and excitement and aliveness every time they get together. So, I mean, if you are really like vibing with someone who's long distance, I think maybe challenge the way that you're thinking about it. My ex is in a long distance relationship, and I'm like, you guys have like the perfect dynamic. Like, I would love to have that. I think it's like, it could be conceivably a beautiful way to have a relationship, but you know, I mean, I guess it's not for everybody, but maybe it could be for you.
Yeah, I think it's like maybe it's like removing the expectations that it's going to mimic or look like what an in-person, in real life relationship looks like. You have to be willing to understand the ways in which the relationship is going to sort of be accelerated in certain ways, and maybe stunted is not quite the right word, but you know what I mean. There are elements that are getting expressed really intensely, and other elements that are being expressed a little bit less intensely. Right? You spend so much time on the phone, but you've less time in physical space with each other.
Yeah.
I was in a long distance relationship for a minute. It's hard if you're a physical touch love language person, I will say. You know?
But when you have the physical touch, it's, you know,
really on.
I think there's going to be so many ways that our relationship structures look different. I think people are going to be married, but like living in houses side by side. I think people are going to be bi-coastal. I think people are, I mean, there's like an explosion of open relationships and ethical non-monogamy. I think it's all like being shook up.
We'll do another hour on that. Got a lot of questions on that. Okay, one more question. What is the best way to deal with gaslighting? Oh my God.
I'm like, well, remove yourself. I mean, I think it's really like your truth does not need defense. And I think you need to pay attention to how much you are attempting to convince another person of the truth and why you're doing that. But I think, like we need to pay attention to how we feel in relationship dynamics with other people. And sometimes that means the loving response is a boundary, or that I like remove myself energetically from a space where I don't feel like I am safe emotionally. And if someone's gaslighting me, I would imagine that leads to a lack of emotional safety over time. So I think certainly the worst thing to do with gaslighting is try to convince the other person of the truth as you see it.
That's a good no. Okay, very quick round of our signature segment.
Okay.
Am I doing it right? Something you're actively working on right now.
Ooh, am I supposed to do these quick? Something I'm actively working on right now is I'm getting back into running, actually, because I had just been doing, you know, like how you go through seasons with different things, and I want to like work up to like doing like maybe a half marathon.
And then you'll do the half marathon, and then you'll move on to
and then I'll go back to yoga, do something else again. It's just how my psyche processes life.
Every 5 years, I'm like, I'm gonna become a runner, and then I run for 2 days. I'm like, I'm not a fucking runner. Something you're bad at, and you're like totally fine with it.
Oh God, how long you got? Something I'm bad at. I mean, like the admin stuff. Like I'm like unapologetically like, this is not what I was put into this body to do. This is like where I need to hire someone to support me in this. Like I'm really okay with like my brain doesn't function that way.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Fuck it. When do you feel most like yourself?
Like when I'm having soulful conversations, when I'm talking about like love and relationships and life and spirit, and just like this feels like what I was put here to do. This is when I feel like most like me.
So beautiful. Adore you.
Oh.
Thank you.
You, my love. Thank you.
Oh my God, come back for many more hours, please.
I would love it.
Thanks to my guest, Dené Logan. Her incredible book, Sovereign Love, is wherever books are sold. I love saying like it's on bookshelves. Like, do people go into bookstores anymore?
I mean, we should. We got to support those bookstores.
Truly. Her website is DenéLogan.com, D-E-N-E, Logan.com. You can sign up for her integration course that's starting.
Thank you.
And as always, thanks to my husband, my crew, to all of you for watching. Please subscribe, comment, share this shit. I need the support. Love you guys. Go have a heartfelt conversation with your partner. Talk to you next time.